I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies. Today on Prosthetic Gods, Nir and I are going to talk to Jose Marichal, a professor of political science at California Lutheran University, and author of the new book, You Must Become an Algorithmic Problem. He is, according to the algorithmic chatbot I asked about him this morning, a critical democratic institutionalist who focuses on everyday algorithmic power and citizen agency. And we all agreed that that was a great description. So welcome, Jose.
Thank you. I'm excited. Yeah, and that's pretty
Welcome.
So this book, as we've already discussed a little bit off air, I did feel a lot of sympathy with the book. The majority of it is a critique of the algorithmic effect on culture and our episteme and democracy in ways that many people are addressing. But I just want to highlight at the beginning that your answers aren't to voluntarily boycott these technologies, but for us to have more algorithmic understanding, more literacy, and and exercise the controls that we have, and then to press for more controls in the world. Is that a general good overview of the argument you've made?
Yeah. We should think about these technologies relationally. We're in relationship with them, and sometimes we think about them more in terms of what they're doing to us, rather than how we contribute to the negative harms that they do to society.
You talk a lot about the algorithmic contract and an analogy to social contract, and maybe a good place to start in understanding your argument is just to have everyone on the same page and ask what is the algorithmic contract and how it's related to social contract.
Yeah. So what's useful about the social contract is this idea that it's a metaphor for trying to understand why we pledge allegiance or pledge obedience or consent to state authority. And if we apply that to technology and think of technology as a socio-technical system, then for me, what I think the socio-technical or the algorithmic contract is that in exchange for managing the deluge of information and cultural content that we receive online, and maybe that's the state of nature, this kind of world of unrestrained, uncontrolled, now, especially with AI, maybe slop, but informational flood. I think I refer
Kibble.
to Kibble in the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
That in exchange for sort of managing that, we're giving these tools that give us the illusion of managing it. So we feel like we're in control when we access recommendation algorithms, or when we engage with pattern detection algorithms like Ring doorbell cameras, and we get relief from the anxiety. There's a great sociologist that I cite that talks about the toil of Rolf Fisher. He talks about the toil of choice, right? And that there's a stress involved. And Nir, I think in some of your work you've talked about this, that there's a stress involved in choosing, and so we let the algorithms choose. Well, we let the algorithms choose for us in a sense, although we think we're in control, but the algorithms are really structuring and patterning and classifying us. We don't really see that, right? Netflix classifies us into thousands of different categories, and then they push content at us based on that classification, but we don't know what classifications we belong to. We don't know how we're grouped. So in exchange for all that relief of anxiety, we give up a lot of this sort of autonomy, this democratic autonomy in a lot of ways to determine our epistemological kind of world.
Well, let's start with the recommendation filters, because I've made a determined effort to defend them on the grounds, for precisely the grounds that you're casting aspersions on them here, which is that another aspect of choice is the paradox of choice. Barry Schwartz has shown, and others have shown, that the more choices that we have, the less we enjoy any of the choices that we make. So part of our heuristic is often to figure out how to constrain our choices so that we're making reasonable choices and not overwhelmed by choice. And recommendation algorithms do that. They say, here's the 3 movies that you probably would enjoy given everything we know about you. And that gives us a sense of protection against, as you're putting it, protection against the chaos of information kibble in the world. You've probably heard Nir and I go back and forth about the historicity of these various complaints. And this is one where it's like, okay, we don't have unlimited choice because the YouTube is saying these are the 3 videos that you probably would enjoy. But isn't that a better situation to be in than 100 years ago where you had one local newspaper, no TV and radio? You could go to a library and buy books, but the amount of informational choice that we are able to exercise today is incomparably more than we've ever had in the past.
Yeah. If it were just recommendation, and we literally did have the agency, right? Then that would be one thing. But then there's also this institutional layer of clustering. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that there is every incentive in the world that if you start from the premise that we are multitudinal, that we are complex and curious and want to learn about the world, and that could be a debatable point. But if you start from that premise that we are complex and multitudinal and mysteries, and then it's going to be very difficult to predict us as subjects. We have patterns. We're creatures of habit. We definitely, I go to work the same way every day. But we're difficult to fully predict. And that's a problem for machine learning models. If you're good for prediction models, right? If I'm an outlier in some of my behaviors, it's really difficult to categorize me and sell me like Google does as a package to advertisers. So if I can't be made more predictable, can my habitus be changed so that I am more likely to conform to the cluster that I've been assigned to? So your argument about recommendation, I think I try to do that, right? I try to be very careful about curating in ways where I'm not where I don't succumb to the classification, right? I try to find orthogonal things that I may or may not think I'm interested in, just to sort of vet myself and to test my whether or not this is really something that I don't like, right? Because we're choosers, we're discerners, and I don't really have an issue with that. I don't think we should change that, but I do think we need to be more reflective about that and not assume that YouTube is really interested in that necessarily, or
the good preference algorithms will show you this is what's trending in your area, this is what's the top of the charts this week, and then this is what we think you would enjoy. And I always find the contrast between those two to be quite illuminating. On the one hand, I do want to know what everybody else is watching, but on the other hand, I want to make my own choices.
Yeah, both are important. The first is incredibly important for democratic society, right? To understand that you're part of a polis or that you're part of a community, and that you need to sometimes get out of your bubble. And at the end of the book, I talk about one of the things that I think is a renegotiation of the algorithmic contract in a beneficial way would be to put yourself in positions where you may be introduced to serendipity. There's a lot of great political scientists who talk about the idea of cross-cutting cleavages. Mm-hmm. Once upon a time, we used to, and I know this could be idyllic, the whole Robert Putnam, social capital thing, but let's take it for what it is. Maybe 20 years ago, I might have coached my kids' softball league, softball team. I might have been in a Rotary Club or the Kiwanis Club. I might have, and I did, play intercity or interleague softball. And so I'd meet people that would have different experiences than me, that have different political orientations than me, that have different cultural interests. Even walking my dogs, I have a neighbor who's really into Formula One. And so I've been like, you know what? I don't know anything about Formula One. I'll watch a couple of the Netflix, series about Formula One. And I'm like, I don't know if this is really for me, but at least I'm exploring, different cultural artifacts. And political scientists will talk about that being really important, to just sort of having a touching base with other people and understanding that there are other selves out there with other priorities and other interests. And it's a pathway towards seeing them as full human beings and being interested in their lives and whatnot.
So tell me, Jose, if this is a fair characterization, because as I was reading your manuscript, I was thinking there's probably a move where the intensity of your argument increases with the introduction of generative AI. So level one of kind of algorithmic contract or curation that's done for you in order to balance, on the one hand, your agency, and on the other hand, the flood of information is, as you say, what's presented to us on Netflix, Spotify, YouTube, etc. Right? It would be great to develop your own taste, your own way in the old liberal fashion, but there's just too much information and it presents it to you, and there's a trade-off there. To some extent, you could, maybe 3-4 years ago, opt out of it. And by the way, social media, which I'm assuming is a huge context for this kind of trade-off, where the news feed that you see is also algorithmically curated. To some extent, you could check in from all of us. You could say, like me, on a good day, I want to listen to my CDs in the car rather than Spotify, and try to kind of intervene in the algorithmic process. But the best sort of description of ChatGPT and Claude and similar AI chatbots in the last couple of years is that they're a profoundly sophisticated method for search, actually, more than anything else, that they give you a very, very increasingly good high-level summary of search, and they start the funneling process, and most of us will actually follow that funneling because it's good. In a way, I see the salience of your argument increasing after. I was more persuaded by your argument if you sort of factor artificial chatbots into it as a mode of search than just the sort of prediction algorithms.
Because they're more directive? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they're more directive, and they save more time, and they're more useful, and they're more difficult to get away from. Like at this point, if I do a literature search without AI, I put myself at a disadvantage compared to somebody who does. But that means that I also, submit more to Jose's algorithmic contract, in which I give up my agency independence and peculiarities for what AI as a search engine rather than anything else gives me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference is one is more clustering, and the other one, so you're clustered into particular communities based on your social media preferences and whatnot. And with AI, it's both very sort of moving to the mean, but also very individualizing. So the moving to the mean is depending on, I don't know, the temperature settings of these AI models, which I don't know if you can play with them with vis-a-vis search, but you're going to get reasonably modal answers to your queries. So that might have sort of a normalizing effect that might be problematic in that way. It's like everybody's going to get the same answer, where you may, like, I'm a big believer that the best of like AI is idea generation and giving people possibilities and different options. But the bigger concern and for me, the more worrying thing is we're kind of in the 2008, 2007, the World Wide Web version of AI. And there's every inclination, especially listening to the way that Sam Altman talks, that they really want to move towards engagement AI, towards personalization AI. So it's more of you're having a synthetic relationship with the AI. When you do search queries, you'll be given clarifying questions, and those clarifying questions will take on the characteristics of sort of a synthetic relationship based on everything that Google knows about you, right? Everything that these tech companies know about you. So it'll have a very, sort of sinister way of like knowing how to build a relationship with you, because it knows you in a very specified, way. Like it can sort of, here, I think you want this, and well, don't you really? I don't know. Who knows where it's going to go? But there is this sense in which we need to worry about an AI that can flatter us, but flatter us in incredibly targeted ways. It doesn't appear like flattering, or like right now, it's very crude flattering.
Yeah,
it's very sycophantic.
I wanted to just expand a little bit more on what you were saying about Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, because the connection you made with Hobbes is that Hobbes thought that we needed to submit to governmental authority because of the chaos that would otherwise ensue in society, and that you're making the connection to our the appeal that, and if you don't use these tools, you'll be in informational chaos, informational kibble, and therefore the surveillance solves one kind of information problem and recommendation algorithms another. Log. I just want to go through the three and have you respond, especially to Rousseau, because I think Rousseau is the most interesting one here. Though your connection with Locke is the preservation of rights, liberal Locke as a kind of keystone of liberal individualist thinking, and choice architectures as what offers us individual control, but may not actually be giving us that much control. But I was really intrigued by what you were trying to say about Rousseau, which is that we have this desire to submit to a general will, to identify a general will, submit to it. And also then later you make the connection to our desire for resacralization of the world and how some of this might come in. So how do you see these submission to algorithms or the use of algorithms fulfilling that need for connecting with the general will?
Thanks. That's a really great question. There's a couple places in the book where I try to draw out that idea of like the relief of anxiety, the relief of the toil of choice is something that traditionally it's been churches, religion, doctrine has been the way, ritual has been the way that we relieve the toil of choice. And that in some ways, algorithms take over that kind of doctrinal role of relieving us from the toil of choice, but in a way that's very consistent with, I talk about the romantics and this kind of sense of like, that we have the inner spark in us, and technology companies sometimes take on this kind of mytho-technical language about what they're doing. And if you listen to Peter Thiel, you listen to a lot of these folks now, they're sort of really amping up kind of the connection between religion and technology. And you guys eloquently talked about it on your last podcast. And so, I think that there is that sense in which we're searching for something, we're searching for meaning, and recommendation algorithms lure us into this belief that we can kind of order the chaos through our own choosing. And, that could be possible, but they don't really allow us to choose. They really group us, and they group us in ways that we can't respond to, like I said before. So if I'm a member of the Catholic Church, I was raised Catholic. You've got the rosary, you've got confession, you've got the sacraments, you've got all of these different ways in which you can relieve the toil of choice through the institution of the church. And, Buddhism, there are all these different ways in which you can practices that you can engage in that help you relieve the toil of choice. The algorithm begins to sort of take on some of these characteristics. And this is the point is, if it's doing this, I think we need to more intentionally realize that is what we're seeking through the engagement with these algorithms and these platforms. And so we should be more intentional about whether or not they're meeting our needs. And objectively, I think that there are lots of ways in which they're not right now. Right? They're not meeting that need to relieve the toil of choice.
My sense is that what you get back from being relieved of the toil of choice is also profoundly different. So in the case of, traditional religious institutions, by submitting to or, sort of using the rosary, taking advantage of confession, having a kind of fixed liturgy, on the one hand, yes, you don't have choice, but on the other hand, the sort of reward for that, if that's the kind of thing you're into, is into a tradition, is the feeling that you're part of a sort of chain of handed down institutions, etc. And there's a lot of people for whom that trade-off is comforting. In the case of the algorithms, the reward is sort of, you don't have to perform any cognitive labor, or you don't have to sort of exercise or develop your taste. So I think there's an argument to be made that the reward structure, in a way, for relieving this toll of choice is more gratifying in religion than it is in this context.
Well, you definitely, and at a couple levels, like on one level, you have a community. And so the toil of choice isn't just a ritual, but it's also the community that you gain from different religious institutions. And and so the other one are the rituals, and the algorithm it gives you it gives you autonomy, perceived autonomy, right? It gives you this perceived notion of I'm able to manage this environment and get exactly what I want, but at the expense of not engaging with otherness in a way that might help you grow and develop and evolve and attain from, like what Aristotle talked about, phronesis, right? Wisdom. And so, yeah, I think that's a concern of mine, that like what, by not reflecting on the contract, we don't grow. We truncate ourselves. Like I use the analogy of machine learning, where we move towards a local minima, like in a gradient descent model, right? We unknowingly fit the clusters that we've been assigned to, because that's the ultimate goal of the recommendation engagement algorithms, is to sort of keep us predictable, keep us clustered in order to sell us to advertisers. And that, yeah, in comparison to the relief of the toil of choice that you also might get from reason, right? From engaging and being a reasonable person and engaging with reasonable others. So it's not only that faith can achieve this for you, but also the pleasures of the life of the mind, and the pursuit of knowledge in that regard, whether tied to religion or secular, can also perhaps give you some of the relief of the toil of choice. Education, like becoming a knowledgeable, educated, curious, reasonable person, could also maybe address some of those things. But we get neither with the algorithm.
Your use of the term gradient descent to find the local minima tickles my theories of complexity bone. So I appreciate that. And what you're implying by that is that there's this algorithmic process in the background that's trying to find the best way to describe reality. And it's running a bunch of calculations and trying to find the most fit algorithmic expression for you. And so it lands someplace. But your reflections on algorithmic architecture later suggest that, well, we could design these systems to provide more choices and also to have better algorithmic expressions of behavior, so that they support more diversity, more intellectual diversity, aesthetic diversity, and so forth. So the problem isn't that there is an algorithmic process trying to find local minima, as you put it. It's that the design space is too constrained, and we need better design spaces to find better minima. Isn't that the solution there?
Yeah. There's a great, sociologist at University of Durham, Louisa Moore, who wrote a book called Cloud Ethics, and her argument is, these algorithms should be providing us with possibilities. Mm-hmm. I'm completely convinced by that argument, that the best of algorithms, AI, are about unlocking potentialities, and that could either be embraced by the left or the right. It's not either or. It could be enchanting the world and unlocking potentialities that bring you closer to the divine, or it could be unlocking potentialities that move you farther away. It doesn't necessarily have a politics that it's easily discernible. But algorithms, and the question then becomes, as we were talking about before, one of structuring the incentives of tech companies, because tech companies, for the moment, and the original sin, as Ethan Zuckerman talked about it, right, is creating these technologies so that the way that you make money on the internet is through advertising, right? And so if the way that you make money on the internet is through advertising, we all have to be packaged as part of a cluster. And then the local minima and gradient descent is, if you're going to be predicted, or if we're trying to predict behavior, how do we reduce the error rate? Or at least that's how I learned in graduate school. How do we reduce the cost function of the model so that the model works well at predicting at whatever the prediction task is? And so if I'm a subject that's not easily predictable, I'm an algorithmic problem. And so that's where part of the book, the title of the book, comes from, right? Is that if I'm not easily predictable, I'm not very useful, or I'm not very optimal as a product to be sold to advertisers, right? And so that is a very sticky problem, and but that's why bringing the thinking of politics and the civic sphere into this conversation about algorithms is important, because the market isn't the only logic that should pervade, and I don't even think it's the most appropriate logic, because, and I have a whole chapter about the Austrian economists and preference formation, all that, and Yeah, it's not the only model, and it's not the most appropriate one, because it's not just providing us with goods, it's also structuring preferences for us in a very, ontological, a priori kind of way that feels like it's more that politics is an important logic to bring into the conversation. And if you bring politics into it, then it also becomes a question of, do we mobilize and have conversations like we're having here, that to really explicitly lay out what is it that we're getting from these algorithms, and what do these algorithms and AI systems owe us? It's not just we can exit, right? The market model is to say, well, you don't like the algorithm, exit. And I think Nir alluded to this before. We don't get to exit, right? We're in this sort of all-encompassing system that structures everybody around us, and it's been doing this for a decade and a half or so. So we don't really get to exit. So if we don't get to exit that easily, we really do need to then exercise voice. The whole classic exit, voice, and loyalty paradigm in politics is voice becomes important, and we need to have this very, very important conversation about what should we demand of these tools that will help promote human flourishing.
See, if I was going to tell the story of the quantification that we can't escape, I would start with tax collecting 10,000 years ago. The state has always been trying to quantify its citizens and categorize them. You're this kind of taxpayer or that kind of taxpayer. You're this kind of lawbreaker, and a slave versus a citizen, and so forth. And so there's this kind of Foucauldian account that what you're describing is not the result of algorithms. It's the result that algorithms are just the result of a 10,000-year-old process of state quantification.
Yeah, exactly. I talk about James Scott in the book, and he great. Just passed away recently, unfortunately. He's a political anthropologist, and he wrote this book called Seeing Like a State. And he focuses a lot on how modernity accelerated this process, and how in modernity, a lot of the work of states is to figure out how to make their citizens legible, right? And how to sort of understand and be able to sort of figure out the patterns and the goings on of citizens, and the norms and practices and meaning-making structures in order to better govern and control them, right? And so there's a book by another great sociologist, Furcade and Healy, about the ordinal society, and they sort of take on the idea of Scott and build onto this idea of we call it high-tech modernism, right? Where it's technological algorithms turbocharge the ability to know subjects. We're providing our meaning-making system to the algorithm in ways that the Stasi in Eastern Europe could have only dreamed of, right? How expensive was it for them to sort of put bugs in cars? I remember showing my students last year a video of like the labor that the Stasi in East Germany would go. They would go the lengths they would go to plant bugs in automobiles and to like embed it in the in the upholstery and the speaker system.
Like half of all these Germans were informants. So
the physical labor that was involved, and so this eliminates all that in ways. And so I say, instead of talking about legibility, we're actually moving more towards editability. It's not even that the state can and these algorithmic systems can know us; they can edit us and make us in the shape that they want us to become. So rather than legibility, it's more editability. So I think that would be the break, I would say, with the sort of the 10,000-year process in a tax collector, is that these algorithms can do more than know us. They can shape us and encourage us to shape ourselves.
Yeah, and it's not the state.
Yeah,
it's not the state. It's
exactly,
corporate entities who are more competent than the state and more energized than the state. And this is an argument that Jay and I, right? And in China, it is the state. And it's an argument that Jay and I quite often have, namely, is a given new technology just a new manifestation of an old pattern, or is it a sort of qualitative break? And I often fall on the latter, and he often falls on the former. But my sense is that here it's not just a sort of parsing for state control. As you say, the project very quickly became editability or moving people to do X, Y, Z rather than just understand them. And it's become cheaper and more effective to do that. I mean, look, I think that's tied irrevocably to your recommendation, Jose, about practicing voice, because the pushback would be, why the hell would I want to practice voice if I have a technology that doesn't only relieve the toil of choice, but rather it relieves toil, period.
Mhm.
Which seems to be the point of agent. So you talked earlier about OpenAI. Consider the ambitions of their next model of ChatGPT 6, and I'm already seeing this in ChatGPT 5. The questions are pretty much, or the proposals are pretty much, do you want me to do your work for you? So whenever a student sort of brainstorms with it, it says, do you want me to put this in an essay for you? Do you want me to draft a 2,000 word essay for you? Do you not? They've just sort of opened the floodgates for generating synthetic pornography, right? Which will certainly be a feature of GPT-6 and will already be available in 5. So do you want an easy gateway to pornography? The model asks you. Do you want a friction-free relationship with stuff like Replica or Character AI? So the reduction of friction is not only removing the toil of choice, it essentially says, let me do your work for you. There's versions of this I know that Jay likes because it's sort of, automated luxury communism or whatever it's called. But my sense is that if that project works well, and I'm, this is no longer Spotify, making a playlist for me. This is like, holy shit, it's doing my job for me. Why wouldn't I want that? And why would I want to use my voice to protect my individuality, which was, to be honest, pretty mediocre and, average anyway?
Wow. To be fair, Sam Altman calls it erotica. And
That's right.
I share your concerns. I was telling James early on, when I listen to you guys, I feel like I'm situated in between you. Like, because I sometimes very much agree with you, Nir. I sometimes very much agree with James. And again, this one I find myself situated in between, because I do see the ways in which possibilities can be made explicit using AI and algorithms. I still see the value in exposing people to different ways of being. Now, but I also agree with you, Nir, that why would somebody, if they are entirely enmeshed in this sort of world of amusement and personal, what is it, like Nozick? What is it called? The pleasure machine? Robert Nozick, the political philosopher, the libertarian political
Experience
philosopher.
machine.
I'm sorry.
Experience machine.
Yeah, the experience machine, right? I mean, I think it's very much what Nozick argued about, right? If you're placed in this machine where you get everything you want and all your pleasures are realized, would you take that machine? And a lot of people, and I think the concern that we have is a lot of people would, and then you have to fall back on, this sense that humans might have, that there's something more beyond my ontology, or the synthetic ontology that's been created for me, that there's a world out there that this all winds up ringing hollow if I just stay in my kind of synthetically generated bubble. And there has to be, there is a leap of faith. There's a little Kierkegaardian leap to extend that, right? There's this leap of faith that you have to take, that humans wouldn't simply be content with that because they'd feel that there's something inauthentic. I mean,
it would start having to feel hollow before you sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I was a literature major as an undergraduate, and I remember reading Brave New World, and this kind of idea that like soma works, in this idea, this pleasure, taking pleasure, pleasure drug, that it works, but that there's always going to be that one person who's like, yeah, this doesn't feel true, this doesn't ring true, right? And I mean, yeah,
cat videos are soma.
Yeah.
Your reflections on outliers and your defense of the outlier as something that algorithms lose. I had the counter reflection, which is that, the instructions that Elon gave to Grok when it started going Mecha Hitler was, don't consider any political point of view out of bounds. Feel free to adopt the most extreme political point of view. And it's like, okay. And it immediately chose Nazism as the most extreme thing to start promoting. So, in some ways, these systems are already demonstrated a left liberal political bias. And so people are complaining bitterly. And that was part of what motivated Elon to do these experiments, to try to get them to not be so left liberal. So I don't mind that kind of bias, right? I think if that's the bias we're going to bake into these systems and send out of the world, that's great. And if it means that there are fewer hate voices being amplified because of the training and the strictures that these systems have put on, I want that. So there's certain kinds of outliers that I want. I've told the story many times about how I ended up becoming a fan of Siberian ethnopop. And it was because of a string of things that I liked on YouTube that eventually led to this very obscure band, or what I consider an obscure band. And I think that happens as often as these other things. But I don't think that we want to universally praise the notion of the outlier, right? Because the outlier is a lot of stuff in the outlier, like flat earthers are in the outlier.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I spent a lot of time in one of the chapters kind of laying out the democratic value of the outlier. And it's certainly true that it sometimes feels like we have too many, we're awash in outliers,
right.
That we somehow, elevate the outlier. And what I think of the outlier is, I guess I want to decontextualize it from these sort of recent market motives that social media produces for us. That in a lot of ways, I don't think the kind of the edgelord, Mecha Hitler, whatever it's called, that's a true real outlier. I think that's an AI trained on a bunch of people that have been habituated towards incentivized towards do something outrageous and it'll get picked up by the engagement algorithm. So keep doing more of that. And for me, I don't see that as a true outlier. I see it more from Mill's experiments in living perspective, where I think maybe you and I would be more in agreement that the great sort of tradition of Mill and Bentham, the utilitarians, were more Mill and the utilitarians, like that we allow individuals to kind of explore the world and sort of try to find truth for themselves in a good faith, right? I mean, I think good faith is like a huge part of this. And if you're engaged in a good faith search to sort of understand the truth and to try to live according to a set of principles, and you engage with others, right? You expose in a very Arendtian kind of way, you expose yourself to others in community. You account for yourself in the public sphere. Others are going to see that, and they may take some of what you're doing and incorporate it and experiment on it and leave others behind. But that there's an assumption of a good faith community trying to engage in different ways of being in the world, right? And you will have your Nazis, your racists without the engagement algorithm. Those folks, I think, when they engage with the community, are very quickly, it kind of dissipates, because they're like, yeah, I don't find what you're doing to be a very useful way for me to live my life, right? You're introducing your way. Hey, if you live like a white supremacist, you'd be better off. And some people might. I mean, I don't want to completely cast that out of hand, but I think for most people, they'd say, yeah, that's not a very useful way to live your life.
At least the rest of us would be better off if they went and lived as the way that they imagine.
But if you have the engagement algorithm saying, hey, this may not be a great way to be in the world, it's not a very virtuous, or it's not going to lead to phronesis or anything like that, the engagement algorithms will say, you're going to get a lot of hits. You're going to be able to monetize this. You're going to get a value, by taking, regular left-right, continuum arguments and just amplifying them and making them really visceral. And I mean, you see how Trump responded to the No Kings rally with the video, with a really graphic and kind of dehumanizing video.
Literally pooping on the American people. Yeah.
And it's like, because I think he gets, okay, well, that form of engagement is very visceral and cascades through the network in a way that rational argument, or getting back to what Nir was talking about, right? Like, rational argument isn't going to be as attractive as sort of visceral, high affect, high valence engagement through AI now, through like making up your own videos. And so When I'm talking about outliers, I think I mean more
and getting reaffirmed for it. I mean, that's how
and getting reaffirmed for it. Yeah.
Self-radicalization on Twitter, both on the left and the right, work. That
absolutely
people
100%
gravitate
agree.
toward the extreme position because everybody's applauding them. But my sense is, and this is something Jay and I also discuss quite often. My sense is that you would need a pretty robust social democratic state to operationalize any of your strategies, Jose, for preserving authenticity, originality, voice. You'd need to sort of have somebody essentially say, well, you think that simulated pornography and fake relationships and machine doing your homework is good for you, but you're wrong. Just like you could be, in a good old-fashioned Aristotelian sense, wrong about being happy or wrong about who your friends are. And what matters as preconditions for a good life are a degree of privacy, a degree of institutions that will help you think critically, a degree of freedom from algorithms, say until you're 16. And we're going to regulate that. In the meantime, in California, we can hardly regulate an AI girlfriend to say that she's an AI. So is that the case?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good
that condition is a social democratic polity for any of this?
I mean, I think the way I look at it is that this is pretty much the traditional venue of pluralist politics. You mobilize, you make claims upon the state, and then the state crafts a regulatory response. And whether or not that requires a social democracy or whether or not that's just the basic functions of a liberal democracy, I would tend to think that a liberal democratic state has a regulatory function. Whether it does it well or not is a separate question, but that it wouldn't necessarily go all the way to the notion of a social democracy to have to enforce it, but it might. So I'm not rejecting your question out of hand. I hadn't really thought about it. I think the way I formulated it is it's very much in the tradition of liberal, pluralist, democratic politics to, mobilize, to make claims upon the state, and the state tries to craft a regulatory response. Obviously, Section 230 in the United States is a massive, impediment to any of this. And yeah, I guess I would take the maybe unsatisfying cop out to say my book ends at here's what we should do, and maybe future books would move towards how would we craft a viable regulatory response to it? But I mean, I'm open to sort of what that would look like, and would it necessitate, a very muscular, like a I don't know, left-wing Hobbesian, right?
Well,
I don't know what you would call it, but
I'm glad you came to that conclusion, because I would have said the same thing about the book, that it proposes a regulatory set of approaches that I appreciate. But one of the principal predictors or principal causes of the tech right elites moving towards MAGA was that Biden tried to impose some very weak, laissez-faire regulations on AI and crypto and just keep them from ripping people off. And they said, okay, well, if you're going to do that, then we're going to go fascist. And it's like, in that situation, I don't know exactly how you can't avoid the conclusion that we have to take away their wealth and power. And I think that's where the democratic socialist or social democratic solution comes in. It says, look at the history of liberal failure. You weren't able to overcome the powers that be. And if you want to get further with your project, you have to take the powers that be away and their power away. And I do think that would be the conclusion of your treatise.
Yeah, if you look at let's just keep it in the United States context. If you look at recent American politics, it's pretty, Citizens United et al., that there's a pretty heavy amount of regulatory capture by not just the tech industry, but by a lot of industry.
Yeah.
And so in this current iteration, it would be very difficult to see how you can muster a standard, like I said, standard pluralist politics to enact some kind of regulatory reforms. But,
of course, we know that the people who are prone to take away wealth and power care deeply about everyone's individuality, choice, and originality.
Comrade, you have to have faith in the state in the long-term success of the communist project.
Dude, when you come to power, I'm moving to Denmark.
I mean, I would turn it back to you guys, and would be really interested in hearing you all maybe help me think through how would you do it in a way that wasn't a regulatory, like a state, like very heavy state involvement, which would have problems of its own. I mean, here's where again I feel like I'm in between the two of you, because I don't know that I always trust the ability of the state to do an effective job of regulating something like speech. But I know a problem exists, and I know that problem probably is felt as deeply on the right as on the left for different ways, because I think both the right and the left, there are theories in conservatism and in liberalism that recognize the multitudinousness, if that's a word, the plurality, the diversity, the complexity of human experience. And so both of them have a vested interest in ensuring that sort of human plurality and human individuality isn't subsumed. And I think both of you agree, but you come at it from different places. Like one of you is suspicious of the ability of the state to do it, and the other thinks that there is a role for a muscular state to can do it. And I'm torn, and I don't quite know, but I just know that I'm concerned about it, and I have a vision for what it would look like to encourage people to become kind of curious, rational, multitudinous, pluralistic in ways that would be beneficial. And I personally worry where that's eroding, and it's just going to erode faster, like exponentially. So
I would say I am noticing some sort of grassroots movement in the direction, Jose, of what you were saying, that there are some people for whom this is unsatisfying, and they kind of start walking away from it. So even the kids occasionally sort of in an organized fashion start putting away the phone when they go out, or start going
dating
on
apps
walks.
are down.
Right. So there are these kind of grassroots cultural tendencies that are slowly growing, that constitute a kind of low burn tech rebellion. I would, my own strategy would be to culturally glorify those in whatever way you can from the ground up. Make movies about them, although all movies are going to be made by AI and under the ultimate direction of Sam Altman, so that might not be a good strategy. But to be serious, that would be sort of my preferred venue, a kind of grassroots glorification of the kind of few resistance moves from the bottom up that we are seeing. That will probably be too slow given the comparative speed at which the technology is growing. I still prefer that to Jay's top-down approach.
In other words, moral invective against people is going to be more effective than state regulation. Yeah.
Yes. Well, not moral. Also, the glorification of people who, don't like this stuff and also don't like commies.
By the community, like so. Right, like the community would kind of glorify these, and maybe there'd be like a prize in school for the least amount of phone use.
I mean, it's the if you want to frame it philosophically, it's the sort of Richard Rorty approach of telling moving, sad stories rather than anything else. I've always found that both attractive and effective.
I mean, as a sociologist, it's always both, right? Like the decline in smoking had very little to do with official government campaigns or stickers on cigarette packs. It was the bottom-up moral disapproval that people had of other smokers, and eventually it became socially unacceptable. So I do think that there'll be, and there already are, bottom-up signs of people learn. I would just phrase it that people are learning how to use these things in ways that are consistent with a healthy life, or trying to figure that out. And that will filter up as a culture. But I do think that we could facilitate the process. And I was going to ask you specifically, the European AI regulations and DSA and DMA laws that they've passed, one of the things that they specified was that you could turn off any algorithm. So if you are in Facebook or Spotify or whatever, there has to be an option to just get some kind of straight temporal feed or whatever it is. That I don't know what the option would be in Spotify, but in a social media platform, you should just be able to get a temporal feed, which turns out to be entirely overwhelming if you have 5,000 friends the way I do. But so are those the kinds of tools and the kinds of regulations that you imagine? I mean, is it the Brussels? Are we trying to promote the Brussels effect?
It's definitely goes a long way towards getting to what I would consider the ideal. And I don't think it would take a muscular regulatory state necessarily to just sort of say, well, if you're going to have to add this dimension to your social media feed. You're going to have to give consumers choice. I have not seen research on what percentage of consumers actually take advantage of that. Right, I wrote a paper with some colleagues about is there a way that you could have sort of like give the user the ability to kind of say how much of this do I want it to come from my feed, and what percentage do I want to come from the recommendation algorithm? Are there ways to sort of give the user more control over what they see? And yeah, I don't know how many people. I would imagine maybe even there's a possibility that maybe if you did that, most users would just opt for the recommendation algorithm anyway. Mm-hmm. Right. But I at the very least, I think that's about the negotiation, about renegotiating the algorithmic and social technical contract, is to say, what do we want? To start from the perspective of what would provide us with a flourishing life. Now let's make demands upon these companies. If these companies aren't going to do it because they have a fiduciary interest to do something else, then this is what the state is for in a democratic society. Even people on the right might say, I don't prefer regulation, but there are times in which we do need a regulatory response to a social condition that is causing significant harm to citizens, because we ultimately believe in liberal democracy, however you define liberal, if it's classical liberalism or if it's more, modern liberalism. So I think that there can be sort of common agreement on, if we as a group mobilize and say, this is what we need for us to be a functional liberal democracy, and you're not going to give it to us because there are monetary incentives, then this is what the state is for. Is to as Carl Polanyi would say, is to set the rules, right? Is to set the rules of the road for the market. So yeah, I mean, I think that what Europe's doing, we'll have to see, right? I mean, devil's in the details, but something that gives users more control might and gives more experiments. I mean, more experiments in how people can set up their own algorithmic life might give people might return the best of mill and the best of utilitarianism and say, hey, I've set my algorithm up this way. I get value out of it, right? At the end of the day, it also requires community. It requires engagement with the other in physical space, right? Beyond just simply spending all of your time engaging online, but also just sort of sharing your experiments and living with others. And that might include experiments in algorithmic living. I got to write that down. I got to think about
that. Right. But this is a community killing technology, as introverts like Jay and myself, know well. It allows us to have this podcast from 3 different places and 2 different time zones, right?
Yeah.
It allows us to talk increasingly and have many of our needs met by synthetic beings. So the preconditions for experiments in living a la Mill, I think, actually are traditional. I'm not sure that they can be upgraded to experiments in algorithmic livings, because that potentially already gives away the farm.
Well, yeah, but then I guess then here's where I agree with you that it does require some kind of a social norm, and I do talk about that at the end of the book. All these, my own 21-year-old has been experimenting with. First, they were going to buy a dumb phone, and then he decided, all right, I'm going to instead change my operating system so that it's very difficult for me to access social media. And a lot of young people that I teach are trying to, like you said, are trying to find a way to navigate a tech-saturated environment. And so there does have to be at some point a return to a celebration of being in physical community with one another.
Yeah, there's a great book by Anthony Appiah called The Honor Code,
Hmm.
and it gives this kind of account of how social practices die away, specifically ones tied to honor. But he talks about how the duel died, how the practice of tying women's feet in China died, how the slave trade became unpopular in Great Britain, and it's essentially has to do with a sense of national embarrassment, that the sort of glorification of the practice is replaced by a sense of national embarrassment from the practice of, people in XYZ think we're idiots and insane for doing ABC. And then slowly it becomes a sort of embarrassment to do it. So that might be an interesting account for, how some of this changes. But in the meantime, I want to tie maybe one, because I know we're over time, but this is interesting, and I want to tie one last thread, Jose, from you were talking earlier about Huxley's Brave New World, and Brave New World became a paradigm for, if you will, now a new form of totalitarianism, softer and more appealing than 1984 kind of totalitarianism, the totalitarianism that makes sort of Putin's or cheese deal of, like, I'll give you bread and circus and you stay out of politics. And algorithmic technology, and specifically generative AI, is the perfect kind of tool for that kind of soft totalitarianism, right? So I'll save you the toil of choice. I'll save you the toil of toil. You just hang out, have virtual relationships. It'll do your work, and we'll take care of the rest. So that's, I think, also part of the political picture.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extension of on the left and on the right. Like I'm thinking of like the one-dimensional man and the Neil Postman and amusing ourselves to death, and there's a long lineage of social thinkers who've kind of written about the bread and circus question that you mentioned. And this is just a very subtle set of techniques for furthering that kind of what you call that soft authoritarianism. And yeah, I think that is one of the motivators for got me interested in writing the book, is after 2016, like the way we were talking about Cambridge Analytica just fell very flat. Because the way that we talked about Cambridge Analytica after 2016 was that, like, they are imposing thoughts on you. It was that kind of traditional authoritarianism way of thinking about how technology works. And I'm like, that just doesn't ring true. And a lot of the stuff about Cambridge Analytica afterwards cast a lot of doubt on whether or not this whole stuff about psychometric profiling is actually all that effective. It's the evidence is very.
I'd love it if it was true, but.
Was that?
I would love it if it was true, because it would imply that we social scientists actually are finally onto something. But
yeah, so I mean, there's some evidence that combined with other techniques, it can be effective, and it certainly sounds intuitive that if you're prone to anxiety, let's use messaging that is going to trigger you. But at least in practice, it doesn't seem like it. So then, if it's not that, then there has to be some way in which we are contributing to whatever. I don't necessarily want to call it authoritarian, but however we're truncating ourselves and reducing our reasonableness, our critical abilities, our plurality, right? And I think big fan of Arendt that this sort of withdrawing and isolation and narrowing and truncating ourselves is what she wrote about, right, in the origins of the totalitarianism, that loneliness of sort of withdrawing and seeing the other as a threat allows for all of the fantabulism, these alternative worlds that you can impose upon people who are so, reduced and alienated from community and alienated from the physical world, that they buy wild stories about how the world is. And if you would have asked me 10 years ago that we'd be in this moment of like what some people believe about the world, it's daunting, right? And I completely agree with your assessment about this kind of soft authoritarianism. And I think part of the book is an effort to try to think through before it's too late, like how do we kind of work our way out of it? And I certainly don't have the answers to it, but this is kind of me thinking out loud for 70 pages or whatever.
You want to say a little bit about your next project, the machine liberalism project?
Yeah. So I'm really excited. I just signed the contract with Intellect Books, which is a London-based publisher, but it's distributed through the University of Chicago in the United States. And this one is, I think, an extension of trying to think about the ways in which liberalism has changed our expectations about freedom and what liberalism under sort of algorithmic and AI rule looks like, and what are the ways in which we practice and experience the world of sort of rights and freedom differently under a regime of algorithms and AI. And a couple of the things that I'm playing with are we value brand more than discourse. And, what does that do to the assumptions about discourse in a liberal society if we're much more interested in brand? And in particular, like Karl Popper's idea of conjecture and refutation. We're not going to engage in conjecture and refutation if we're more interested in brand, because refutation is against brand, right? What does it mean when politics goes from, being about sort of a collective overlapping consensus seeking truth to more about aesthetics, right? And, there's so many people who've written about that, like Walter Benjamin. And, when politics becomes about aesthetics, typically in the 20th century, bad things happen, right? And I think we're prioritizing aesthetics over argument. I think we're prioritizing prediction over deterrence. So if we can eliminate threats in the environment, and we can use AI software to eliminate threats, ring cameras to identify threats before we have to engage with them, that's a very illiberal practice, right? Because deterrence is about a human liberal subject whose mind can be changed. But if we can use AI to just sort of eliminate threats, like I think about the way in which we're blowing boats out of the water in Venezuela and Colombia without really due process or without sort of vetting whether or not our intel is correct. And I'm sure they're using AI to do that. And so, I think that's another one of those that it's like, well, we're in a liberal society, we're using these tools. So
your interests will probably converge with ours, because our next project is also going to be on AI and military matters. And this issue of military targeting, of course, is central. Yeah. So excellent. I highly recommend. We've been speaking with Jose Marichal, who's a professor at California Lutheran University and the author of the forthcoming You Must Become an Algorithmic Problem.
Thank you.
Jose, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Nir. Thank you, James. Had a great time.